Good afternoon, everyone. This is Eric Prince with a Merion West discussion between Paul Gottfried and Henry George. Paul Gottfried is the editor-in-chief of Chronicles, the author of 14 books, a regular contributor to American Greatness and the American Conservative, and has written a few op-eds with us at Merion West in the past couple of months, and is served as a professor of humanities at Elizabethtown College for many years. And Henry George is one of our sort of key writers at Merion West. So really looking forward to the two of them chatting about a variety of topics. So Henry, I think you have some sort of conversation topics prepared centered around a Paleoconservative Anthology, New Voices from an Old Tradition that Dr. Gottfried recently assembled.
Yeah. So, Paul, thank you for taking the time to speak to me today. It's a real honor to be speaking to you about this subject. So I feel I'd start off by talking about this anthology that you recently edited and published, A Paleoconservative Anthology. So for people who don't know the intricacies of the American conservative movements, could you give a brief description of what paleoconservatism is and maybe how it differs from the sort of the mainstream American conservative movement?
Right. I mean, whatever paleoconservatism is, it is so distasteful to the American conservative establishment that most anyone associated with is not invited to write for mainstream conservative particularly National Review. The paleoconservatives come along mostly in the 1980s as a reaction against the ascendancy of the neoconservatives in the American conservative movement. And they're the ones who hold out and do not accept the reconfiguration of the right or of the authorized conservative movement that is carried out by the neoconservatives, typically in alliance with the left center from which they come. And some of the paleoconservatives go back to an earlier period of American conservatism, like in the 1950s. Some of them were part of the original National Review board of contributors. Others come along later, and they're essentially conservative scholars, intellectuals, who resent the manner in which the neoconservatives take over the conservative movement. One of the decisive events in precipitating this break was something that happened to a Southern scholar, literary scholar, Emmy Bradford, who was designated to be the head of the National Endowment for Humanities, and the neoconservatives waged a journalistic character assassination campaign against him, and were able to convince the White House and Ronald Reagan to offer the position to their favorite, who was William Bennett, who was then a liberal Democrat. They attacked Bradford because he had expressed sympathy for the Confederacy, because he was overly critical of Lincoln and so forth. The real reason, as far as I could figure out, is they did not want this backward Southern bigot, or whatever they viewed him as, to take a position which they wanted to control for patronage reasons, because the NEH provide millions of dollars of patronage every year to so-called scholars and to institutions in which the neoconservatives had influence, or in which they wanted to place their people. So they didn't want this patronage prize to go to someone they didn't like. So they proceeded to attack him, really to destroy him professionally. And this made people, some of the people on the old right, traditional right, very, very upset. Others, of course, I think learned the lesson that if you don't give the neoconservatives what they want, they will do to you what they did to Mel Bradford, and a kind of terror campaign. And this, I think, precipitates the split. But the neoconservatives land up controlling National Review, Heritage Foundation, most of what is called the Washington conservative foundation community lands up in the hands of neoconservatives. They have tremendous influence. I mean, they bring with them very, very wealthy donors. And many of them were well established within, one might say, the liberal journalistic establishment before they became neoconservatives. Some of them became Republicans, others didn't even bother to switch parties. Some even remained Democrats. What I think probably got them to move into the conservative camp was they could take it over quite easily. And most conservatives just went to work for them, and to transform themselves into neoconservatives. The paleoconservatives were the holdouts. And they weren't necessarily people who had been famous in the conservative movement before, but they do emerge as the leaders of the opposition. And then in the 1990s, there's a very concerted effort made by the conservative establishment, led by Bill Buckley, by the way, to just marginalize these people. And the paleoconservatives have been pretty much marginalized ever since. Chronicles magazine is, their flagship publication. They've also had periods of cooperation with more conservative libertarians who are members of the Mises Institute. And for a while, through the John Randolph Club in the 1990s, there was an alliance. They even had their own presidential candidate, and Pat Buchanan, who identified himself very strongly as a paleoconservative. And the neoconservatives, of course, went after him and attacked him as a racist, an anti-Semite, a bigot, all the usual charges. But I would think until the mid 1990s, the paleoconservatives seemed to be very competitive with the conservative establishment. Then they just fell behind, where they've remained ever since. It's simply, and by now they're a kind of historical memory. Although I think some of their ideas have imprinted the populist right, the younger generation. Some of the paleoconservatives, like Sam Francis, were proto-populist. Others, of course, were strict constitutionalists, sectionalists, neo-Jeffersonians. Paleoconservatives, as I argue in my book, are not entirely consistent. Some seem to lean in the sort of strict constitutionalist, states' rights tradition. Others are sort of populist centralist. But wherever they stand, I think they're sort of equally unacceptable to what has become the conservative establishment.
Well, that's great. You've actually answered several of my questions in one go. That's really good. Thank you. So just on the subject of the neoconservatives, could we give a little bit of a brief potted history of who they are and where they come from, just so people have the differences between the paleocons and the neocons at the forefront?
Yeah. The neocons are the ones who take over the conservative movement from the left in the 1980s. And many of them come from an Eastern European Jewish urban milieu, particularly from New York City, some from Chicago. They bring with them a certain set of interest. They're very strongly Zionistic, and they object to the fact that the Democratic Party had become less pro-Israel in the 1980s. They also, at least initially, object to what they see as Black anti-Semitism, and to, one might say, the leftist drift of the civil rights movement, which concerns them a great deal. And on most moral questions, they are conservative. They sound very much like traditional conservatives. There's very little difference. Neoconservatives later will attack Buchanan as homophobic, but in 1992 they do. So I think 1996, when I think it was the 1996 election, whenever they had a meeting in San Francisco, and Buchanan said something that seemed to be derogatory about gays, at least by indirection, they went after him. But earlier, the neoconservatives were constantly declaiming against gays. And there was no group that was more anti-gay than the neoconservatives. They were also critical of the feminist movement. So on some of these moral issues, at least the first generation were quite conservative. The second generation have thrown all of this to the wind. On most social issues, they're pretty much with the left. Although on foreign policy, they still talk about global democracy. They run the National Foundation for Democracies. They're neo-Wilsonian activist when it comes to international relations. They haven't changed that. And that seems to be the one characteristic of neoconservatives that their critics identify with them. So when you hear even people who are not particularly conservative saying, I'm no neoconservative, what they mean is, I believe in a more restrained foreign policy. That's what it generally means. The paleoconservatives generally come from, once say all over the conservative movement, but, are made up typically of those who do not like the neoconservatives, and particularly on foreign policy. Foreign policy is like the major issue. Neoconservatives will later attack paleoconservatives as racist or white nationalists. As I pointed out in my books on conservatism, that is not the major dividing line in the 1980s at all. The major dividing line is foreign policy. And of course, the paleoconservatives, whom I say were generally more conservative, so that they, sympathize, let's say, with the South African regime. Against the Black nationalists and the followers of Nelson Mandela, and they had less of this sort of global democratic idealism. They were very contemptuous of this, but race was not at all a major issue at the time, and there were even Jewish paleoconservatives. Even though the neoconservatives later attacked paleoconservatives as anti-Semites. So most of the charges that the conservative establishment will later take over, and which you find in somebody like Jonah Goldberg when he expresses his contempt for these people, has nothing really to do with why the paleoconservatives will break in the first place.
Yeah, and on the foreign policy question, I remember Jean Kirkpatrick is one of the the first generation,
right?
Not the paleocons, the neoconservatives. She, in the aftermath of the Cold War, called for America to become a normal country again, in a famous piece that she wrote. And I think it was Irving Kristol who even said that maybe America should withdraw from NATO, but I'm not certain on that, so I can't say that for sure. But the point being is that the first generation, even though foreign policy was the big dividing line between them and the paleos, they were the first generation neocons were much less crusading in that way than their second generation descendants, it seems to me.
Well, some of them break off.
Okay.
Jean Kirkpatrick actually becomes an opponent of the neoconservatives.
Oh, interesting. Okay, I didn't know that.
Went much too far. And Irving Kristol sort of spoke out of both sides of his mouth. He gave all the support for the global democratic revolution, and for the, even found or supported an institute that pushed this position. But if you read some of his statements, he seems to sound like a paleoconservative.
Yeah.
Seems to be very critical of the project that he's helping to subsidize.
Okay, interesting. So this, you mentioned the fact that the paleoconservatives, their influence is sort of reappearing among some of the populist right today. So how influential do you think their ideas still are today amongst the so-called new right?
Yeah, I think that they're sort of looked back upon as some kind of predecessor, particularly Sam Francis, who seems to have a profound, although he published only one book. It was a collection of it, one book during his lifetime. Then his work on managerialism was published posthumously. But he's best remembered for his articles in Chronicles magazine. And those sort of form the ideological basis of the populist movement. People say, you really he's a white nationalist. Well, he was toward the end of his life, and most of his writings have nothing to do with that.
Yeah, definitely.
And people who don't like the populist will say, well, Sam Francis was this or that. But the populist movement does seem to be influenced. Pedro Gonzalez, who is one of our editors, is an absolutely worshipful disciple of Sam Francis. He writes on him, quotes him, and many of the other populists do this as well. But not all paleoconservatives are populist. That's another. Some of them are Southern states rightists. Others are sort of strict constitutionalists. So I think there would be this tension that would develop if the paleoconservatives were ever to come to power, which seems unlikely at this point. But they do influence, I think, by now broad segments of the new right, particularly in the younger generation. As I've argued, most of the conservative movement is outside of the conservative establishment, which has very narrow parameters, and a multitude of gatekeepers. So everybody else is outside. There was a fellow with whom I've been having this debate on various types of liberalism, 19th century liberalism, whether we should blame the present left on liberal pluralism. And these are interesting debates. Neither one of us is allowed to write for National Review or for most mainstream conservative publications. And most of their discussions are utterly boring. So I would say much of the action that goes on among conservatives takes place outside of one might say the authorized conservative movement, or the kinds of people you'll see on Fox News who represent the authorized movement. And if you meet a younger person who's not part of the authorized movement, when it says he's on the right, you can be sure he's influenced by Sam Francis or by somebody like that.
Paul, can you speak a little bit more to this strain within paleoconservatism that is focused on a strict interpretation of the Constitution? Because at least from where I sit, it seems as though in sort of discussions about the paleoconservative movement, that particular strain perhaps doesn't receive as much airtime.
Yeah, I think it is very, I mean, our legal scholar who writes for us, Stephen Presser, who had an endowed chair at Northwestern for many years, is a strict constitutionalist. Believe it or not, Sam Francis was a strict constitutionalist. Always talking about congressional power, the danger of executive overreach. I mean, at the same time, he's identified with Caesarism, right-wing authoritarian, whatever, but he's a strict constitutionalist. And I think that this is almost the kind of impulse among traditional conservatives, which you still see in paleoconservatives, even in the ones who are populist, like Pedro Gonzalez. When it comes to discussing constitutional issues, he'll end up taking a strict constitution. He'll attack Trump, for not observing the Constitution. So one might say there's almost a kind of ambivalence that runs through paleoconservatism between the strict constitutionalism, which I think is very much present, and we have a lot of people writing from that position, and the right-wing populism. I think you can find both.
Do you share Pedro Gonzalez's criticisms of Trump along those sort of constitutional grounds?
I don't know, certainly constitutional grounds. I think most of his criticism of Trump, I hate to say this, I think they're entirely appropriate. As I tell people, if I have no other choice, I will vote for Trump in a general election, particularly against the Democrats, who I think are abhorrent. But he would not be my first choice. And I think it's very, I don't know how some of my friends who are on the right and defend Trump, but are very educated people, I don't know how they can stand some of the things that he's saying, which just sounds silly to me.
Henry, I didn't mean to jump in. Let me, I'll let you get sort of back on track with your line of questioning.
No trouble. That actually leads quite well into my next question. So,
okay, really good.
Yeah, on the matter of Donald Trump. So you mentioned Donald Trump and Pat Buchanan. Why do you think Donald Trump succeeded where Pat Buchanan failed? Because they're both. Pat Buchanan had this quote back in 2017. He said, "The idea succeeded, but I failed." Or I didn't, rather. So why did Trump win where Pat Buchanan couldn't? Was it just because he came along at the right time and Pat Buchanan didn't, or were there other factors at play?
I think there are other factors at play. For one thing, Trump did not have the conservative Catholic baggage that Buchanan did. And I'm using the word baggage, not at all in a negative sense. I do respect him as a man of high principle. Trump is sort of a late and not very convincing convert to right to life. after spending his life being pro-abortion. I don't think anybody, is fooled that he's really a moral traditional. I mean, you have to be pretty dumb to believe that. I mean,
Yeah,
you could say that
yeah.
he's taking the position that the religious right may like, but I think you get the real thing. I mean, he's a very conservative, devout Catholic who is strongly against abortion. Also, he takes what is now would be a totally unacceptable position in the conservative movement. He spoke about the Confederacy with great sympathy, Buchanan. Trump, I think, may have criticized in passing, the pulling down of Robert E. Lee's statue, but he's not really going in that direction. So,
Well, Paul, except as you probably do recall, he was very concerned about the efforts to rename U.S. military installations that were named for Confederate officers.
Yeah, but I mean that's really not a position that came up when Pat Buchanan, was running for president, and I think he has to say something like that to keep his conservative, particularly Southern conservative base behind him. And it also seems to be pro-military, right? Because what's being done to change things is probably not very popular in the military. But Buchanan went down, I think it was to Alabama, Louisiana, and was praising his Confederate ancestors there and their heroism. That would no longer be acceptable. So I think that one reason that Trump does succeed where Buchanan failed is he's much less conservative. There is a populist appeal, but he's not really taking what Sam Francis would say the hard positions or the hard stuff. He's avoiding certain things that the media would really come after him. They come after him anyhow, even more fiercely. If he were defending the Confederacy, or if he were as far to the right on moral issues. Have you noticed that Donald Trump has come out in support of gay marriage more than once?
Mm-hmm.
I could not imagine Buchanan ever doing that.
Paul, what was your relationship sort of like with Pat Buchanan?
Well, I did not have as close a relationship to Buchanan as I did with Nixon, whom I saw many times. I didn't see Pat that often. And, I did discover that he wrote a very nice column about one of my books. I was not even aware of that. I discovered that last week. But I've not seen Pat for a very, very long time. And I've only rarely exchanged email notes with him over the last few years. But I think going back to the 1980s, we were personal friends. And I was the co-chairman of his campaign in Pennsylvania in 1992.
Because I know sometimes in Wikipedia or various pieces written about you, they sort of make a lot of your relationship with Pat Buchanan. I know you mentioned before to me that you knew President Nixon a lot better. Do you have any sort of quick stories about any time you spent with him?
Yeah, that'd be interesting.
Yeah, he was one of the smartest men I've ever met. Wow. And he was very pleasant and sweet, in company, in small company. He was an absolute klutz, in front of a TV camera. And his speeches were unbelievably horrible. The problem was he was not an actual politician. It was all forced. Yeah. He sounded phony.
Yeah.
But he was highly intelligent and he knew a lot about foreign policy. And, I had discussions with him about Hegel, Hobbes. Actually read these people.
Well, I think he said that on his farewell speech to White House staff. He said, "I'm not educated, but I do read books."
Oh yes, he read books, and he sent me or gave me along when I went to his house for dinner, some kind of yellow pad in which he was writing. He was writing a book on famous people he had met, and I don't know what I did with that yellow pad. I think worth $1 billion. Like
you could auction it off.
Yeah,
Paul, you get more.
It's all handwritten
toys.
And he was an extremely good writer. I would definitely recruit him for Chronicles. If he was still around. So I found him an all-around impressive person, and one of the most impressive people I've ever met. I did get to meet Ronald Reagan once. I was not impressed at all. Unlike my encounters with Richard Nixon, which actually blew me over.
That's you mentioned the word encounters. I read your memoir of the same name, which is your sort of your intellectual memoir. Could you some of the people you mentioned there might surprise some people. Could you talk about some of those and who they were and what influence they had on you?
Which ones?
Oh, true. So maybe the fact that you knew Herbert Marquis and Christopher Lasch and people like that, people from the left side of the political spectrum.
Yeah, the person who had a profound influence on me, and is hardly ever mentioned in connection with me, although his most important disciple, Robert Paquette, always said that his teacher spoke highly of me, was Gene Genovese.
Oh, yes.
I was heavily influenced by Gene when he was a Marxist, or when he claimed to be a Marxist, but was probably politically to the right of me, but claimed to be a Marxist. And his work on the world the slaveholders built and on the Southern gentry, I thought was absolutely just was incredibly well written, and revealed very deep knowledge of the sources and this. He just totally immersed himself in this work. And most of his conclusions, sort of given his Gramscian interpretation of Marxism, sounded very conservative, like he was defending the Southern gentry class in all this writing. Well, not necessarily, denigrating the slave class, but for a Marxist, he seemed to be remarkably sympathetic to his subject, who were slave owners, and he always was. But he sort of was doing this from a position, from a critical position in his assessment of rising capitalism in the 19th century. Marcuse was important because he taught me a lot of German philosophy, and I thought he was an extremely impressive speaker. And later, I had a recording of his German lectures, the Berliner Vorträge, which he gave in 1973, and I returned, and I read that in German. I saw it in translation. So I was very impressed by his knowledge of philosophy and by his attempts to reconfigure Marxism. I say this, not being a Marxist, but I could appreciate his intellectual depth. And as I've said again and again, if I look at the American conservative movement, they seem much less impressive to me than any number of German Marxists that I've studied, who had better minds, who were probably more conservative at the end of the day. I admit this to people. I do have this this predilection for German Marxism of a certain kind, and also for Italian Marxism. I'm a great fan of Gramsci. I have very broad taste when it comes to some of these thinkers. Somebody else I mentioned is Robert Nisbet, who appreciates European counter-revolutionaries. His dissertation was, I think, on Bonal, Le Comte de Bonal, and he also wrote on Mestre and others. He liked French counter-revolutionaries, and I developed the same interest. I thought these people were very perceptive. As you know, I also admire Burke, who I think, is telling us less about the French Revolution than what the left has now become. He's almost prescient, looking well beyond the French Revolution in the 70s.
200 years ago.
Yeah, he's a brilliant insight into the leftist mind. So I did like Robert Nisbet's writing, and he also, I think, uncovered the conservative side of Marx, which was the awareness of human beings as social.
Yes.
In contrast to the sort of secondhand vulgar Lockeanism, that individual rights, individuals create themselves, and all the sort of nonsense. He understood that people are socially situated, and they have relationships to classes and so forth. So I also knew, I think I mentioned John Lukács, who reminded me,
yes, I think you did,
my
yes.
father. Very much the same background, even looked like him. And I liked him enormously as a person, and we were close friends. And he was somebody who wrote very imaginatively and intuitively about history. Did not really strike me so much as a trained historian as somebody who thought very imaginatively about the past. So he makes it into my pantheon. I'm trying to remember who were some of the other. My father, I obviously discuss who else is in that book.
Oh, it's been a while. I'm sorry, it's been a while since I read it, but yeah.
Oh, Eric von Kuhnelt-Leddihn,
Yes,
the
that's
Austrian
yeah,
Freiherr,
yes.
yeah, who I thought was really a fascinating person. And he spoke about a dozen languages fluently. And I
Gosh,
remember
wow.
I once heard him give a lecture, and he was about 90 at the time. And he quoted from Genesis, first in Hebrew, and then from the Septuagint. He gave you the Greek translation. I had studied both Hebrew and Greek.
Wow.
I can tell he was correct.
Yeah,
He was an incredible
that's
linguist,
impressive.
and it was a man of he was an excellent stylist, particularly in German, but he wrote English well, and he was an artist too. And he was an aristocrat. He was a monarchist, um, and he also thought of himself as sort of as an early liberal, and his notions of liberalism sort of, you know, helped me develop my interest in liberalism as the ideal of the bourgeoisie, which I discuss in my book on After Liberalism.
Mm.
Because the liberalism I'm defending is basically Kuhnelt-Leddihn's liberalism, and he's a constitutional monarchist in the 19th century sense, you know, and a member of the Austrian lower aristocracy. But he sort of got me thinking about, you know, what liberalism had meant, let's say in 1848, if you were living in Central Europe. And then, of course, we have, you know, liberals writing for the New York Times and the Guardian, and they absolutely have nothing in common, right?
Yeah,
Paul, can
absolutely.
you, obviously at Merion West in the past through Henry's, friend, Matt McManus did a number of pieces, about French counter-revolutionary thinkers, but they were very critical. So to
Mhm.
sort of get the other side of the coin, would you be able to share some key insights that you find particularly interesting from, those counter-revolutionary thinkers?
Which ones were talking? Mestra?
Yeah,
Uh,
Yeah,
Mestra and
well,
yeah,
that's the
mostly,
one,
yeah,
yeah,
Henry, as you remember, Matt usually
and
took aim
someone like
at.
Donoso Cortez in Spain is also interesting, although he's more of a Catholic counter-Reformation thinker. But I think but a lot of these counter-revolutionaries understand, and there were many of them in Italy and other places, Germany. You have someone like Albrecht von Haller, Friedrich von Stahl, others who are writing. I think they understand the dynamics of revolution very well. You know, I've had this debate with my friend Alex Riley, who says, you know, the civil rights movement was great. All it had to do was stop like 1955 or 1950 or something like that. And it was, these people are pretty good. And there was no reason for it to go on. And I understand the momentum of revolution from reading Counter-Revolutionaries or someone like Burke in England. They're absolutely right. You can't stop these things once they start. And it's a process. Revolution is a process, and it just becomes more and more radical. And once it starts, it's hard to stop, like the woke revolution we're living through right now, which is in many ways the most radical revolution that has ever existed in the West or ever taken place in the West. And it's almost unstoppable. And I think you have to go back to the counter-revolutionaries to understand the unstoppability of revolution. As opposed to, you know, something happening over a period of centuries. That's different. You can have long-range historical developments. Those are different, so that you move from feudal aristocracy to urban bourgeoisie over so many centuries in Europe. And it doesn't happen at once, obviously. You know, it goes on from the late Middle Ages all the way down into the 19th century. But when you see, you know, the world is turned on its head, you know, things you were raised to believe, like there's men, there's women, only women can give birth. And so, you know, no, that this is not true anymore. You understand that you've just been living through something that is like what the counter-revolutionaries saw, but even more radical. And now the one thing that most of the counter-revolutionaries, some of them believe, that you reach sort of the what is called, you know, the Thermidorian point, where you simply can't go on, and there's going to be a backlash against the revolution. But, you know, someone like Donoso Cortez says, you know, why? Why is this going to happen? And to him, the ending is going to be apocalyptic. It's just, you know, it's called catastrophism. It'll just get worse or become more radical. And this is something I think the counter-revolutionaries understand, which liberals of the early 19th century do not in many cases, because they assume that, at some point, the revolution is going to stop and things are going to go back and it'll just be moderate and everything will be nice again. And I think the counter-revolutionaries have a much grimmer, but in some ways more realistic picture of what a social and political upheaval looks like.
We had an article at Merion West called "What if the pendulum doesn't swing back?" which
Right.
was sort of an anticipation of the fact that maybe it'll just keep going. Henry, you want to hop back in?
Sure. So I thought I'd go from this to something a little bit different, moving towards the last part of this conversation. So you've written extensively about the philosopher Leo Strauss, and he has quite a large sway within the modern American conservative movement. So I was wondering if you could give a sort of brief rundown of who Leo Strauss was and what was his defining philosophical perspective that marked him out.
Yeah, as you know, I did a book on Leo Strauss and the conservative movement.
Yeah,
It was not exactly well received by Straussians, and did not receive as many reviews, I think, as Cambridge University Press was hoping. And Leo Strauss was a German Jewish professor of political theory who sort of began his career in Germany, and then after 1933, he is forced to leave. He goes to Paris. I think he goes to England for a while and lands up in the United States. For a while, he's teaching at the New School for Social Research in New York, then lands a position at University of Chicago and becomes very much of a fixture there. And the book that actually puts him, one might say, on the political ideological map is Natural Right and History, which is published as which are his Walgreen lectures given after the Second World War, which will have an enormous influence, particularly on conservatives. There's nothing, in my view, that's conservative about them, but the fact that he's attacking historicism is very important, and relativism.
and he attacks Edwin Burke as well at the end.
Oh yeah, but Burke is but an
The whole
historicist and a
chapter.
relativist.
Yeah. So he's
He has
doubly
these-
bad. Yeah.
He has these tides or these waves of modernity, which pretty much destroy traditional society. And I don't remember whether Burke is in the second or third wave, but his is pretty bad. And because he brings with him the belief that one can, supposedly he brings in the belief that one determines moral truth by one's historical situation.
Yeah, and historical situation only, and without reference to any higher transcendent truth.
Which is nonsense in the case.
Yeah, it's just not. It's not true. It's not true. I mean, he literally Burke in his letters talks about natural law and everything. So yeah, it's not true.
Yeah, there's a book written by my former colleague at Rockford College and friend Peter Stanlis on Burke and the Natural Law, which shows that Burke has very much of a traditional Aristotelian understanding of morality. And I would have guessed that, but somehow it is interesting that the Burke revival and the Strauss revival take place simultaneously on the right.
Oh, that's interesting.
And many people see no conflict between the two.
Yeah, well, they need to read more, because obviously there's a deep conflict.
Yeah, but it tells you something about the intellectual incoherence of the conservative movement even back then.
Fair enough. So that's a really good introduction to who he was and what he thought. So could you, because you wrote this book about him, which I read, which I found very interesting, could you briefly give some of your criticisms of his political philosophy and why you think his vision is somewhat lacking?
Well, I go into a methodological criticism of Strauss, which I think is generally even truer of his disciples. And I do not write disrespectfully about him, because we come from the same ethnic background. We had the same interests. I feel almost a kind of personal affinity to him. So the idea that I'm somehow hostile to him is entirely untrue.
He also has
I just don't find him. I am hostile to some of his disciples, particularly the East Coast Straussians, for personal reasons, because I think they're very difficult to deal with. I think they're very intolerant, unpleasant people. and what they're saying are very often lies that they, try to inflict on other people. One of my problems with Strauss is that his secret writing, it starts out, he believes that that most great writers and the political thinkers in the past had to hide their thoughts because they were living with the problem of censorship, which we now don't have. Of course, we do. It's more extreme than ever.
Yeah.
But he says, we're freer to now to express our ideas. So people used to have to write in a coded way.
This would be the distinction between esoteric writing and exoteric writing.
Right, exactly. Right, the esoteric writing is the hidden form, and then the
true meaning.
exoteric, is like exoterein in Greek is that which is externalized. You can see this. So my problem is that why does everybody? I ask, why does everybody sound like Strauss and his disciples in their hidden writing? I mean, it's quite possible, I point out, that that somebody is a Protestant living in a Catholic country and hiding that, that they're Protestants, or somebody's a Catholic living in why are they always hiding the fact that they are Jewish neoconservatives living in an apartment in Chicago? They all sound like, at the end, like Straussians, right? I mean, so that is always that's always the esoteric truth, is that all these people in the past who were bright had to sound like like Straussians, because that's the only way. That's the way bright people think. So I mean, if you, in fact, there was this priest, I think Father Fortin or somebody, who wrote on Dante, and was insisting that Dante was really a religious skeptic. Well, the person writing was a Jesuit, but I would think that Dante is a very religious Catholic, but no, because this is the esoteric reading if you're a Straussian. Same with Solzhenitsyn, by the way. So you sort of wonder after a while, and this sort of starts with Strauss. And my view is that even if one can determine, and I think it's underdetermined, that all these people are engaging in esoteric writing, why would I assume their real thoughts coincide with my thoughts living in a certain situation in the 20th century? That's my first question.
Yeah.
Right. The other thing is, how can I understand? This is something that Hans Georg Gadamer asked. How can I understand people without looking at their historical situation? They're not, or social. They're not abstract human beings. I mean, they live within a certain context. So you cannot ignore their historical context. Although Strauss does not do this all the time. Sometimes he does bring up historical questions of historical context, only to dismiss them afterwards. So this is another problem that I have. So finally, Strauss has this idea that philosophy or classical philosophy is always rational philosophy. Now, there's certainly a rational aspect to it. But why would I not believe that Plato believes in gods? I mean, why would I think he's a? No, I know there's Averroes or other medieval Arab philosophers, others who say this, but I find this very unconvincing when someone says that I believe in these gods, or I believe that the soul is reborn and there is a soul, besuche, or why would I think that this is some made up story, or that this is really a myth that somebody's telling me to teach me a Straussian lesson or something like that? So this is another problem I have with with Strauss. When it comes to classical teaching, someone like Eric Voegelin I find much more convincing. When it comes to classical Plato and Aristotle, I find him much more convincing. Although I think Strauss was probably the greater classical scholar. I mean, if I'm sort of like looking at both. So I don't really dismiss Strauss. I just find his methodology very questionable. He also wrote some extremely good work.
Yeah, he was a good writer, technically speaking. I found him very clear to read, which not all philosophers are. So
he's clear to read in English or in German. His early work. So
absolutely,
his work on Carl Schmitt is extremely good. The Anmerkung zum Begriff des Politischen that he wrote when he was very young is extremely impressive. And his work on Hobbes, which I've
Mm,
read, is extremely good. So he was certainly capable of doing serious scholarship.
yeah. Well, he had the ability to convey complex ideas in clear language, which I think is the mark of
Mhm,
someone who knows how to write and has ideas to write with, which is
mhm,
is always impressive. Um, you mentioned his that Strauss, that is, you mentioned his anti-historicism. So in contrast, you wrote a book back in the 80s, I believe it was The Historical Search for Meaning, about Hegel and the lack of recognition of history on the American right and the role that history
mhm,
plays.
mhm.
So what in your view is the place of history in human life and political affairs? And after that, how can it be a source of synthesis between the tension between the universal and the particular, which is what Strauss basically fails to achieve, in my view?
Yeah, I think that one always has to be aware of one's historical situation.
Mm,
And it's very, you really have no map in terms of human life unless you see
yeah,
yourself within an historical and a social context.
yeah.
Um, you don't understand how you got to where you are. Um, uh, I think I've written these nasty comments about Mark Levin's book American Marxism, and it's entirely not nonsense. I mean, most of the wokeness I've argued has nothing to do with Marxism, and most of the people of Levin's sites were not Marxist. John Dewey's
Well,
not
I mean,
Marxist.
he talks about the Franklin School, so I don't take
Yeah,
that book
yeah,
entirely
and
seriously.
even they're very weird Marxists. Um, and we've also gone beyond the Frankfurt School by now in terms of our social and cultural radicalism. Why is this simply the evolution of Marx? And I think if you study history, you're aware that things change. You're dealing with new movements. You can't blame everything on, something. Another argument I've been at, people try to blame everything on something called liberalism, which goes back to the 13th century and was no nominalism back then, or some. Movements change. You're dealing with new things, and just to try to demonize something in the distant past and say this is, this is what we're dealing with now. I think is historically inaccurate. I think one has to take account of historical continuities and historical changes, both. But finally, I've sort of argued in a moral sense that we cannot speak about human rights or rights generally unless we look at them in an historical context. And why is it more important to believe in my right to own a gun if I say it is a human right or something like that, if I say it is a right which was given to free Englishmen in the Middle Ages and which is valued as a legacy of freedom for the last 800 years or 1,000 years, and is part of our tradition of freedom that goes all the way back to the Middle Ages. Now, that to me is much more impressive than having these imaginary rights, which are, I suppose, not injected into us at birth, or I don't know how you get these rights. As you see, I do not believe in natural right. I do not believe certainly in human rights, which I think is a journalistic invention. But I do believe in historical rights, like Burke. I think so. I suppose that makes me a traditional conservative in my understanding of right.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned Burke, so I think that ties into the last question I have for you nicely. So there's been the last few years, there's been this national conservatism movement that sort of gained momentum.
Mhm.
And we're both signatories to the statement of principles that was put out by Yoram Hazony. I just wondered what your view is of the NatCon movement, as as what it represents, and if it's you obviously think it's a positive development, otherwise you wouldn't have put your name to it. So what's your take on national conservatism?
Well, let me see. Generally, I think it's a positive force, and I think Hazony has done a good job, in sort of
Mm,
bringing this movement he and his assistants are bringing this movement into existence.
mm,
And most people on the populist right of the United States sympathize with national conservatism. Having said that, I think there is a necessary split between the American experience and the European experience.
and that's the universal and the particular coming
Yeah, I
through
mean,
again.
if I were a Lithuanian or a Pole, I would be a national conservative, all right? It doesn't make any sense to me in the American context. I mean, I have to be honest. And in the case of the United States, I'm a radical decentralist. I would not have been in the 18th century. I would have been a Hamiltonian, not a Jeffersonian, but historical situations change. And now I think the United States is, much too large. I think the deep state, the centralized administration under which we live, all these other things are very negative forces that destroy community, destroy traditional morality, destroy even a sense of who we are and a sense of community. So in the United States, I'm a radical decentralist. If I were living in Poland or Lithuania, I don't know, but maybe England, I would still be a national conservative. In the case of the United States, it just doesn't work anymore. That's my objection. Most of the people who come and speak, I like them and I agree with what they're saying, but I don't think the European nationalist model works here.
Yeah, no, but sorry, Barrett, go ahead.
I think a lot of potential remedies to our sort of ills that so many of us are noticing and experiencing is one of the best sort of methods for ameliorating that, to return more power to smaller and smaller political organizations.
Yes, I totally agree. The smaller the better. The United States has ceased to be a nation in any kind of historic sense that I can understand. It's too diverse, too large. I think this is one of the observations that George Kennan made at the age of about 104, that the country can be split up easily into 10 different regions. But I think in the case of the United States, we have an ideological split, which it may be much more important than the fact that the country is overgrown or has too many ethnicities living here or whatever. I think there's no way that either Eric or I want to live in a society that is run by Kamala Harris, right? Or
It's true.
or even
I
can't stand Josh Shapiro or Fetterman.
Well, of the three people in the conversation, two of them, me and Paul Gottfried, are actually sitting in the same political organization of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania.
That's right. Which organization is this? Which one are we both in?
No, I mean, we're in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania.
Yeah,
we're political,
for better or worse.
Yeah.
We're in the same Commonwealth of Pennsylvania.
Right. We're in the same sort of degree of, on the ordering of political organizations, we're in sort of the same
right
state/Commonwealth.
Although I point out that I'm living in what's probably a much more conservative community than you are.
That's true. That's true.
I think that my community voted about 90% for Trump.
I can't help but quickly think about Michael Oakeshott a little bit when he's talking about perhaps one of the central conservative truths being a desire for the decentralization of power, whether from government, whether corporate, and that being an essential sort of through line, linking perhaps a number of people or organizations that might have that label of conservative.
Yeah, I'm woefully underread in my Oakeshott, so I'll leave this one to Paul.
Yeah, was Oakeshott a conservative? I mean, he seems to be a certain kind of liberal.
Yeah, he's sort of a 19th century liberal, I guess.
Right, he's a 19th century liberal of a certain kind.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I can't comment because I haven't read him enough. So
yeah, it's radically decentralist, but
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So maybe just to sort of close things out with the anthology, which is sort of how we began the conversation, as we were discussing the other day, Paul, National Review, sort of one of your long-standing foils of sort, published a piece that sort of mentioned you by name and was in response to the anthology. And I'm wondering, sort of as that's germinated in your mind the past few days, if you have sort of any further thoughts on that piece.
Yeah. The most remarkable thing about the piece is it actually mentioned my name. I've only appeared as the Germans would say ein Schimpfwort. I mean, you know, a term of derision there since, you know, the 1980s. And I think I had a book review, a national review about 1987, 1988.
I think you mentioned that.
Yeah, and since then, I'm only mentioned once or twice. Usually you attack me for being against the Iraqi invasion or something like that. So I've really become a non-person. While National Review has just continued to move to the left, as far as I can see. So the fact that I was mentioned is important. And there should be some sort of suggestion that it may have been an oversight not to have mentioned me for like the last 40 years or something. I published all these books, which they deliberately ignored. I mean, some of my books exist in multiple translation. The national, and I'm a self-identified person. They would never review me or mention my books. So suddenly I was removed. I was sort of partially rehabilitated. I suppose it's like living in Stalin's Russia or something, and you get partially your name, like they'll play some theme from your music, you know, Shostakovich or somebody else, and they decided to deperson or unfriend. So I mean that happened to me. I was annoyed though that they brought up this business that I'm some kind that I was an associate of white nationalists, and this is what I'm responding to. Let's say this is all true. The answer is, who cares? Why should we even care? We're living in a country that is just permeated with anti-white racism. We hear this night and day. Douglas Murray, who's hardly a far rightist, wrote something on this this epidemic of anti-white racism. But here we're worried that not I, but I may have known somebody who was friendly with somebody who had expressed white racist ideas. I find this this gesture by the conservative movement utterly despicable. I mean, there's no reason for any of it. I mean, what do you? It's like I'm more virtuous than you are because I'm going to condemn you because you knew somebody who expressed white nationalist ideas. Well, I don't want to fool, you know, I don't want to hide this at all. National Review used to always express pro-white ideas. It was very, very anti-civil rights movement. A number of their writers were for segregation. These people have not been erased yet. Okay, they were well to the right of me at the time. They're well to the right of me now. Why am I condemned? Because I knew somebody who expressed. So I find this to be utterly repulsive. I mean, even to bring up this thing, and particularly at this point in American history. I mean, it's just you know, if we were living with in a society run by white nationalist extremists, I could understand why you might. Given our historical situation, it is utterly ridiculous and anachronistic to do something like this. And I think it's a kind of virtue signaling. You know, we're still good guys, and he's not quite good enough to be part of our group. Well, at this point, I couldn't care. And you know, having said that, there were a few observations that were about paleoconservatives, and I looked at it, were true. I did not consider this to be a full rehabilitation. Now, the question is, why would they even bother to partially rehabilitate me? And I think they understand the political situation has changed. That National Review, no matter how well-heeled it is, no matter how much money it's getting from donors, including electronic media, does not represent most people on the right anymore. They're not what National Review was in 1960. Or even in 1980. So I think that they probably feel they have to reach out to some paleoconservatives or people of the younger generation who might read me or cite me. So I think they may have been self-interest that accounts for this this partial rehabilitation.
I think Henry alluded to this, and you and I have discussed it in the past, but I think you have indicated that if there is a group of people in American society, especially as we're saying, who might be called conservative, they're often perhaps in the younger generation, especially, that there seems to be an interest. Henry and I are on Twitter, perhaps a little more than you are, Paul, but there seem to be a lot of kind of these young Gen Z types who seem
Right.
to be engaging with your ideas. And as you sort of allude to with some of the other thinkers like yourself, maybe they don't know the exact genesis of where
Yeah.
these thoughts are coming from, but some of the ideas, and this is, I think, also sort of dovetailing with what Henry was talking about Pat Buchanan's famous Politico magazine interview. I didn't win, but the ideas won. That there does seem to be a little bit of a rediscovery there that perhaps some of the National Review folks are a little out of step with.
No, I think you're right. I think they're very much out of step. And they're sort of identified by now, and I think rightly so, with the Republican establishment. You know, they're very anti-Trump. They sounded actually, as I argued in a piece that I wrote, much worse than Liz Cheney. I mean, they were just absolutely hysterically anti-Trump. And I think that this turned off a lot of people, even those like myself who were not particularly pro-Trump. But I mean, it's like, you know, whom are you trying to impress by taking these extreme positions, particularly, you know, given the obvious agenda of the other side, which is to destroy all of our civil liberties, bring down I mean, what the left is doing to this country is unconscionable, and to sort of make Trump your story, and, you know, Trump trying to overthrow the government and so forth, I think really raises a question about what priorities they have.
Okay, I want to close with two final questions, if you gentlemen can indulge me. Paul, we're a little farther along in the primary cycle. Obviously, we're still going toward that first debate. I don't want to spoil for anyone who had previously been sort of leaning toward, but do you have sort of an endorsement of one of the candidates right now?
Well, I mean, I've been endorsing for a long time Ron DeSantis, although I said I would vote for Trump. Now, some of the other Republicans, I could see myself voting for Larry Elder, although he's not going to go anywhere, or Vivek or somebody like that. There's some Republicans that I would be very hard pressed to vote for, like Pence or Christie or Nikki Haley. But I would hope it's DeSantis. I'd be very surprised if it's not Trump. I think he has so much momentum behind him. And I think, as I said, the major reason he has this momentum behind him is that for the majority of Republicans, he is the president. They see he was cheated out. And from their point of view, he was cheated out of this. And whether there was election fraud or the kind of rigging that Molly Hemingway has written about, where all these special interests and the FBI and others get together to rig it, he obviously was the victim of wrongdoing, continues to be the selective victim, one might say, of the Justice Department and the Democratic left. So he does enjoy this tremendous sympathy because of what he's been through. But I would hope that the person who is nominated in the end is DeSantis.
And now to close out and give a little plug for the book for anyone watching, to encourage them maybe to pick up a copy, can you share a particularly telling vignette or section from that book that you think might really resonate with prospective readers and get them to say, you know what, let's take a look at these giants of
I think the
conservative
book is
thinking?
worth reading because of the diversity of views on the right that you encounter. And you have to remember that most of the people, you know, on the right who are writing here, who are presenting their ideas here, are presenting ideas that would not be acceptable any longer in the conservative movement. Okay, or only exist on the fringes of that movement. Although I think most of the presentations are extremely reasonable. So what you really have is a collection of points of view from the right that are no longer accepted as the mainstream.
Paul, Henry, thanks so much for participating in this conversation. Really enjoyed it. And once again, the book is A Paleoconservative Anthology, New Voices from an Old Tradition. So thanks for chatting, gentlemen.